Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to you all over the world who see and hear these sermons. We're in a series of sermons on the book of Acts, and we've come to chapter 19, verse 23, and we'll read until the end of the chapter. It begins about that time, and the time was when Paul had been in Ephesus for a long time, and there had been the magicians who had serious problems with the evil spirits, and many of them had come and burnt their scrolls in public, renouncing the magical practices, having become Christians. So there was quite an influence of Paul and the other Christians in the city. It wasn't something that nobody noticed. And Paul was also preparing to leave the city and go to Jerusalem and other places. So about that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. Now, the Christians as a group were often called the Way, which is different from saying the church or something that you believe or something that you belong to. The Way means a lifestyle. And Christians are not called the Way anymore, but it's a good thing to think of that Christianity really is the lifestyle of Jesus and not just joining a club or associating culturally with one religious group or another. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, another name for Artemis is Diana, and she was worshipped for centuries before this and was an extremely popular goddess. And she was the goddess of nature, the protector of wild animals, and the goddess of the hunt, and the goddess of fertility. And you may have seen the pictures of the statues of her that have 20 breasts. And so it was obviously a symbol of fertility. Who made shrines, silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business." And the business would have been selling little shrines, religious decorations, and ornaments to remind people of Diana and to pray to her and to make little offerings to her for the local citizens and also for tourists who came, because Ephesus was the center of Diana worship. "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and practically the whole province of Asia." Now, Luke had already written that the influence of the Christians, Paul and his fellow workers, was in the whole province of Asia. So this much is clear and true. He says, and this is the real charge that he makes against Paul, he says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. And it's easy to believe that he actually said that in Ephesus because he'd already said it in Athens in chapter 17. Then going on in verse 27, Demetrius says, "There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name," and this is one example of religion and business being connected together, which usually is not a very good combination, and it comes to be more business than religion. But also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis or Diana will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. Now, the temple that he speaks of was outside the city of Ephesus and was enormous. It was 4 times the size of the Acropolis in Athens, and it was 60 feet tall. The columns were 60 feet tall, and it was a magnificent building with a magnificent altar next to it. And it was a tourist attraction and a major center of worship. And the Ephesus was the guardian of the central temple of Artemis. So that was a very important part of the city. And of course, a lot of people made business on this religious center and the pilgrims. And he brings the subject away from the economy and the craftsmanship to religious fervor, because he's saying that the goddess that we all worship, the goddess who gives us our income, the goddess who is our patroness, will be robbed of her divine majesty, and people won't worship her anymore and will be out of jobs. And so the combination of the economic threat and the religious threat was really incendiary. Verse 28, when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, what's happening is a riot is starting, or a lynch mob is starting. And these kinds of things happen in our day, in the 21st century. So in various places, rumors of blasphemy cause riots and lynch mobs, and people are killed. Or rumors of beef eating, of eating a sacred cow in India, start religious riots, and people are killed. So it's not something that is just history, it's something that is now. So they shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," which seemed to have been the religious slogan that was used in the liturgies, but also it was something that people said to each other all the time, and it was a very short statement of faith. And people said this and proclaimed this very often, and everybody knew it, and so it became a chant or a mantra that they said. Soon the whole city was in an uproar, because they went outside and they were making noise, and people joined, and it got bigger and bigger and louder and louder. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater. So they most likely wanted to get Paul and take him into the theater, but they found two of his traveling companions who were also preaching the gospel, and they were Gentiles, not Jews, which is significant. They went into the theater, which was inside the city, and we have the ruins of it today, and it seated about 25,000 people. So there was plenty of space for a huge crowd to be there. Verse 30, Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him, because they realized it was a really dangerous, volatile situation. Even some of the officials of the province, who were called Asiarchs, because Ephesus was the capital of the province of Asia, and there were various leaders and officials who were noble, wealthy people who were in the capital at that time and who knew Paul, and some of them possibly had become Christians. Friends of Paul sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. Verse 32, the assembly was in confusion. The word assembly is interesting because the Greek word is ekklesia, which is the word that is almost always used for the church, the assembly. And it's related to synagogue, synchronism, coming together, the assembly of the Jews in the synagogue, ekklesia, the assembly. Some were shouting one thing, some another. So they were shouting different kinds of things. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. And this happens. I remember a friend of mine went to a large demonstration in Basel a few years ago and stood next to a woman who was serving refreshments to the crowd and asked her, what is really the subject of this demonstration? And the woman said, oh, I don't know, it's just something to do. So this happens. People follow the crowd, and it's exciting, and they go, but they don't know what it's about. But they're glad to be in a great crowd and shout and be involved in a way, even though they have no idea what's going on. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander in the front, and they shouted instructions to him. Now, Alexander would have been someone with great speaking abilities and a leader of some sort, and Paul was a Jew, and the main accusation was against Paul. And the Jews who had not followed Paul, who had not become a Christian, wanted to distance themselves from the accusation that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. Even though they believed that, they weren't the ones who were saying that in the city streets. So the Jews wanted Alexander to speak and to say, we didn't do this. We are not the cause of this problem. It is not Jews, although Paul is a Jew, it is the Christians who are the cause of the problem. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, and the Jews were not extremely popular in the city, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So here we have an early example of canceling. And we know this in recent history when professors are invited to speak at a university and certain groups disagree with what the speaker is saying. Instead of having a dialogue, they demonstrate and shout slogans like "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," so that the speaker cannot speak. So here, Alexander is canceled. And they shouted for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." 2 hours of chanting together is a very emotional, social, religious experience. So it would have been profound for these thousands of people gathered together. It was a religious slogan or something like a mantra, which, said repeatedly in a large group, has a great emotional, social power to it. Verse 35, the city clerk, who would have been something like the mayor, and who would have been the person responsible for keeping order in the city and making sure that the law courts functioned properly, and also was the liaison between Rome and the imperial government and the province of Asia and the capital city of Ephesus. So a very important man, and probably the most powerful man in the city. The city clerk quieted the crowd, so you can see his power. He stood up, and they were all quiet because they were afraid of disobeying him. He had power. And said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image?" So this clerk was a powerful man and a very wise man. And it seemed to me that we're going to see that God used this man for God's purposes, even though he was most likely not a Christian. And this means that we should be praying for our leaders, whether they're Christians or not, whether we agree with their political views or not. We should be praying that God would use these people, whether they know him or not, for his purposes. And here we have an example of that happening, that I think it's reasonable for us to hope that if we ask God for it, that he will do it again. Doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image? Now that's a rhetorical question, and he expects the answer no. And he is disarming Demetrius, the leader of this whole situation, because Demetrius had said that the reputation in the world of Artemis is in danger because of what Paul is doing. And this clerk is saying it's obvious that it's a huge situation and the whole world knows, and here we have this great temple and all these people come. There is no danger of this. So he disarms Demetrius. And then he says, which fell from heaven. Her image fell from heaven. And here he is disarming Paul, because Paul, the accusation against Paul is that he said that images made by human hands are no gods at all. And the clerk is saying the image we have of Artemis was not made by human hands. It fell from heaven. It was most likely a meteorite. And other religious groups have begun with a meteorite and have built a huge system and temples around the meteorite through history, and it was considered something that God gave as a sign and as a reality of blessing the people, and it was a connection with God. So some kind of meteorite fell, and it was a stone, and it may have looked like something, and they put it in the temple, and the stone was worshipped. And this was not made by human hands, and because it was divine, it was legitimate to make copies or variations of this, and that is what Demetrius and the silversmiths were doing. So the clerk disarms Demetrius and then supports him and says, this isn't really going on. Paul is saying God's made by human hands, but our God is not made by human hands. So Paul's accusation doesn't apply to us. You see how really wise he was and how he was able to handle the situation. Then in verse 36, therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. So he's saying you're rioting in panic about something that is not actually happening at all. There's no danger to panic about. You have brought these men here, these two men, Gaius and Aristarchus, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. So they had not committed the crimes that people were shouting about. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. So here he's rebuking Demetrius for causing a riot and saying there are proper ways to do this that Demetrius should have used. Verse 40, as it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting or insurrection because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion or uproar, and the Greek implies conspiracy. So he's warning them that this kind of riot will be seen by Rome as a conspiracy against Rome, and that the privileges of the city might be taken away because they won't have any way to explain or support their rioting. Because he says, in that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion since there is no reason for it. It's just a crazy riot. After he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. So he had the power to just send them all home. Here we see another example in a long string of examples of Luke recording a legal courtroom or a civic riot situation where Paul is justified. And he is writing it for Theophilus, who was a Roman wealthy man, an honorable man. He calls him most excellent Theophilus, and he wrote the Gospel of Luke for Theophilus as well. Luke probably knew Theophilus, and Theophilus was a very influential man in Rome. Paul was in Rome accused of treason against Rome. And the book of Acts has a series of false accusations of treason against Paul and his being justified in the legal system. So, among other things, the book of Acts is a legal brief to a lawyer in Rome, or perhaps even a judge, defending Paul and showing that he has been accused of treason many times and proven innocent. And so this time, when he is accused before Caesar, it would be reasonable to pronounce him innocent as well. So a couple of things that we take away from this passage is that we should pray that God will use leaders to do his will. And we should live the way and walk the walk of Jesus and not just carry a label or join a club or be socially or racially connected with some kind of organization. May God bless you all. Amen.